The person who is involved in this perception is no longer an individual, for in such perception the individual has lost himself. He is pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of knowledge. Arthur Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Representation. Imagine just for a moment that yourself disappears, not you sleeping, not you distracted, you awake, but without you. No ego, no body, no thoughts, only raw awareness. This isn't a concept plucked from philosophy books or abstract meditation practices. It's a state reported across cultures and centuries, a state where self-boundaries collapse, and all that remains is the immediacy of experience, limitless, unfiltered. This was the experience that changed neuroscientist Christof Koch's life during the pandemic. A moment suspended outside of time. A brutal yet sublime solipsism that tore away every personal reference. There was no world, no form, only terror, wonder, and the absolute certainty that he had entered a different state of being. He described it not with poetic flourish, but with scientific awe. His mind reduced to pure observation, stripped of history, future, personality. For a few seconds that felt eternal, he existed without identity, like a telescope with no astronomer, just perception, just awareness. Koch is no mystic. He's one of the most brilliant minds in the study of consciousness. And yet, that personal experience pushed him to question the very limits of what we understand as the self. For centuries, we've believed ourselves to be a fixed identity, a me that watches, thinks, acts, and remembers. But modern neuroscience reveals something unsettling. That me is a temporary, flexible construction, a collection of mental processes, autobiographical memory, thoughts, emotions, plans, inner speech, that emerge, interweave, and fade away. The ego is a phenomenon, not an essence. And yet, we spend our lives trapped inside it. Our minds, like badly tuned radios, never stop transmitting. Judgments, complaints, fears, loops. That inner narrator never stops. It replays past embarrassments. It worries about tomorrow. It shouts over the present moment. Most people never realize that they are not the voice, but the listener behind it. This internal storm, what Buddhism calls monkey mind, is one of the greatest sources of human suffering. The ego doesn't just interpret the world, it distorts it. Often it turns it into a private hell. Koch describes how, under certain conditions, that ego can vanish, if only briefly. These moments of me without me don't only occur during the extraordinary, they arise in the everyday. When we are fully immersed in an activity, playing football, climbing a mountain, solving a maths problem, writing code, the world fades. The inner voice goes quiet. Time stands still. No one is there. And paradoxically, that is when we are most present. We call this the flow state, and it's one of the purest forms of awareness. The problem is, it doesn't last long. A flicker of distraction, and the ego returns, narrating, doubting, demanding. In Koch's experience during the pandemic, that state was total. It wasn't just focused attention. It was the complete absence of self, body, time, and space. Something so radical that it left a permanent imprint. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was undeniably true. And this is where Schopenhauer's quote comes to life. What some call ego dissolution, others name spiritual awakening. It's not fantasy. It's a biological possibility, a mental one, a real one. What's most surprising is that this form of awareness, without ego, without narrative, without boundary, can be just as real as pain, love, or pleasure. What's illusory, Koch says, is not the experience of self, but the belief that the self is permanent, authentic, essential. The truth is more radical. We are processes, not entities. That realization, in the middle of a global crisis, marked a clear before and after for Koch, not as metaphor, but as lived revelation. A break in existence, a crack in the framework of the mind. And through that crack, light poured in. Not metaphorical light, but clarity. A deep knowing that the self we defend, polish, and protect every day might just be a mirage we mistake for a mirror. Perhaps you too have felt it, just for a moment. That brief disappearance, that second where you were no one. Only presence, only now. What if that state is not the exception, but the gateway to a new way of being? Perhaps the self you believe yourself to be is nothing more than a refined illusion, not an intentional lie, but an emergent phenomenon that your brain fabricates day after day without your realizing it. That inner voice that says, "This is me," might only be an echo of thousands of intertwined mental processes. Neuroscientist Christof Koch asserts it with clarity. The self is not a stable entity, but a dynamic configuration of thoughts, memories, emotions, and inner language. A moldable ensemble of brain functions built throughout childhood and reassembled with every new experience. We are not born with an ego. We assemble one. From neuroscience, this self that we feel as the center of consciousness depends on multiple brain regions working together. Among them, the anterior and posterior cingulate cortices and the medial prefrontal cortex, situated along the brain's midline. These areas don't work in isolation. They are part of a dynamic and finely tuned system of feedback loops that constantly shape our internal experience. When we reflect on ourselves, imagine what others think of us, or plan future actions, we are engaging a mental network that simulates being someone. But what if this simulation isn't as stable as we think? In recent years, brain imaging studies have revealed that the default mode network, often associated with self-referential thinking, quiets during altered states of consciousness. Whether triggered by psychedelics, deep meditation, or even intense physical activity, this reduction in activity correlates with reports of ego dissolution. This suggests that the sense of self is less a core truth and more a pattern that can be interrupted. Some researchers even speculate that the self might be like a story we tell ourselves, coherent in hindsight, but constructed moment to moment. And just as stories can be rewritten, so too can our inner narrative. The implications are profound. If the self is a process, not a permanent structure, then transformation isn't just possible. It's built into our nature. These regions support autobiographical memory, future projection, introspection, and inner dialogue. In other words, they create the feeling of being someone. Yet that feeling is neither consistent nor solid. It changes, it adjusts, it fades. It even disappears momentarily in flow states, when solving a complex problem, playing music, scaling a mountain, or engaging in deep meditation. In those moments, the ego dissolves, and a kind of narratorless, pure, silent, full awareness emerges. However, that stillness is fragile. Just a single slip of attention is enough for the ego to return with force. Thoughts erupt, mind stirs, insecurities arise. Like a restless creature, the self demands its place. And with it come mental ruminations, constant worry, catastrophizing, harsh self-criticism, anxiety. That self, seeming to be an ally, can also become our greatest oppressor. Koch expresses it plainly. The self is as real as pain or pleasure. But believing that this self has a true permanent essence, a sort of authentic self that defines who we are, is an illusion. Buddhism taught long ago, there is no real self, just a chain of changing phenomena. And yet, in modern culture, the idea of the true self persists. Authenticity has become a commodity. Politicians strive to project images of themselves as genuine, authentic, real. But all of that, Koch says, is a construction, a disguise that shifts with circumstance. We believe we are someone stable across time, when in truth we are a multiplicity of cognitive modules assembling and disassembling like pieces of an invisible mechanism. The experiencing self, the moment-living self, is not the same as the remembering self, which reconstructs history through its own biases. This idea is not merely philosophical, it is liberating. If the self is a construct, it can be changed. We are not bound to a fixed identity. We are not captives of our inner narrative. But embracing this is not simple. It entails relinquishing the illusion of permanence. It entails recognizing that what we call I is as transient as an emotion, as flexible as a thought. Schopenhauer anticipated it early. True perception occurs when the individual dissolves. Koch confirms from science, the self is useful, yes, but also an invisible prison. And breaking its bars may be the first step toward deeper mental freedom. What if, all of a sudden, the world vanished, and in its place remained only light, love, and an undeniable certainty that everything, you, the universe, time, is one? This is not metaphor. It is a phenomenon that has been documented repeatedly throughout history, and those who have lived through it are never quite the same again. On the night of November 23rd, 1654, mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal jotted down a few words that were later discovered sewn inside his coat. Fire, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, not of the philosophers. In that moment, he had encountered the sacred directly, overwhelmingly, and undeniably. That single experience reshaped the entire trajectory of his life. According to neuroscientist Christof Koch, mystical experiences of this nature represent moments of radical transformation. During such events, the ego dissolves, and what remains is an ecstatic, expansive form of consciousness, filled with a wordless kind of knowing that feels truer than any intellectual understanding. Philosopher William James famously referred to this as the noetic quality, a kind of knowledge that is not taught or deduced, but rather revealed, as if from another layer of reality. And history is full of encounters just like this. St. Paul, once a fierce persecutor of early Christians, became their greatest champion after a blinding light stopped him on the road to Damascus. He heard a voice. His identity shattered, then reassembled into something wholly new. The same is true for mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila, and Joan of Arc, who reported visions, divine voices, and unexplainable clarity. But not all such awakenings come through religion. Jane Goodall, the primatologist who spent years immersed in the African jungle, described an overwhelming moment of unity with the forest. Her sense of self faded entirely, replaced by a feeling of connection to every tree, animal, and gust of wind. There was no me, only life, she said, finding herself unable to fully articulate what had happened. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell had a similarly profound revelation while gazing back at Earth from the Apollo 14 mission. Suspended in the blackness of space, he was struck by a deep love for all living things. He called it a spiritual epiphany, a seismic shift in how he understood existence. This sensation has been reported by many astronauts, and it is now known as the overview effect. Even outside science and religion, people stumble upon this sense of unity in unexpected ways. Aldous Huxley, under the influence of mescaline, wrote that love seemed to be the very fabric of the cosmos. W.H. Auden, in a moment of poetic clarity, described loving one's neighbor because in that instant there was no difference. Philosopher Martin Buber wrote of dissolving into oneness with the divine. Music, too, can act as a portal. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that pure aesthetic contemplation, whether through art, landscape, or symphony, could suspend the duality of subject and object. In that state, the observer dissolves, and only the observed remains, resonating as a single, unified being. Cultures across the world have long pursued these experiences. Through fasting, solitude, dance, breathwork, or intense meditation, human beings have crafted pathways to the ineffable, not through logic, but through surrender. Sometimes these moments are quiet. Other times they arrive like thunder. For Koch, his own transformative experience came not in a church nor in the forest, but under the influence of a psychoactive compound, what some call the God molecule. It dismantled his ego completely. Time vanished. Space became irrelevant. There was only presence. And what took the place of the self? Some would call it an hallucination, others a chemical trick of the brain. But there is a growing view that such states may offer a genuine glimpse into what Koch calls the real, a layer of awareness that exists beyond the confines of the personal mind. There are no easy answers, but one thing is clear. Those who cross that threshold do not return unchanged. They no longer fear death. They no longer chase after material things. Something essential has shifted, and even if they cannot explain it in words, they carry that knowing within them, always. The world doesn't look the same, and perhaps, more importantly, they don't either. They've seen something, touched something, and what if, instead of being an anomaly, this state of unity is the natural condition we've forgotten? Not a departure from reality, but a return to it. Since ancient times, shamans, healers, and seekers of the sacred have turned to substances that alter consciousness, not to escape the world, but to transcend it. These medicines of the soul, now known as psychedelics or entheogens, have been used to heal, to see, to die, and to be reborn. Christof Koch, a scientist and thinker, confesses that it was in the twilight of his life when he decided to step through that doorway. With a substance known as the God molecule, he experienced ego death. Not as a metaphor, but as a literal experience. Everything dissolved. Time, space, body, identity. All that remained was naked awareness, face to face with the abyss and the light. He described that moment as being in a corner of Eden before the fall. He looked at a wooden bench and saw it as though for the first time. Every moss, every vibration, every hue pulsed with its own life. The world was no longer an idea. It was a visible miracle. And this kind of experience is not unique. In the ceremonies of Santo Daime, a Brazilian tradition that fuses Christianity and shamanism, the ayahuasca brew opens inner portals. There, beneath stars and sacred hymns, Koch himself was guided by Padrinho Paulo Roberto Silva e Souza. He experienced what he called mind at large, an expanded mind that questioned the very fabric of reality. What if everything, matter, body, cosmos, was simply a manifestation of mind. Some researchers argue that what's accessed under these substances isn't mere hallucination, but a deep layer of cognition usually filtered out by the brain's default mode network. This filtering system, while essential for daily survival, may also blind us to aspects of consciousness we are not evolved to perceive. What we call expanded consciousness might actually be our natural state, temporarily revealed when the brain's usual restrictions are lifted. It's not about escaping reality, but about seeing more of it than we ever thought possible. The intensity of these experiences is no accident. Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist, demonstrated this in 1962 with the Good Friday experiment. Using psilocybin inside a university chapel, participants reported ego dissolution, encounters with the divine, and a timeless sense of unity. Decades later, many still affirmed it was the most important spiritual moment of their lives. Psychedelics, far from recreational drugs, act as deep tools. In proper doses and controlled settings, they deactivate the brain's ego network, allowing consciousness to expand. Colors intensify, forms come alive, the world becomes hyper-real. Like Hergé's illustrations in Tintin, according to Koch, where each detail vibrates with hidden meaning. But not everything is beauty. Dark visions may arise too, primal fears, buried traumas. Like fire, these substances can illuminate or burn. That's why traditional use has always been accompanied by ritual, guidance, and preparation. From a neuroscientific perspective, Judson Brewer discovered that these states of openness reduce activity in brain regions linked with self-judgment and anxiety. In essence, the ego falls silent and the inner world is set free. One might expect such freedom to be fleeting, but for some, the echoes remain for years. Koch puts it plainly, in 1,000 masses, he never saw heaven. But one night beneath the stars, surrounded by chants and ayahuasca, he realized the mystery isn't out there, it's within. And perhaps there is nothing more real than that vision. The irony of this journey is striking. In our quest to know the mind, we sometimes must lose it. Psychedelics, properly used, don't cloud reality. They strip it bare. They dismantle the walls we mistake for the self, revealing a raw encounter with existence. It's no wonder indigenous cultures treat these plants with reverence. They are not merely chemical compounds. They are keys, ancient, potent, to unlock something we forgot we had lost. And for those willing to walk through the door, what awaits may not be comfort, but truth. To die, Ernest Hemingway once wrote, was the easiest thing he had ever done. He penned those words after surviving an explosion on the battlefield. Years later, he transformed that ordeal into fiction in the snows of Kilimanjaro, where the protagonist, at death's threshold, is led through a storm by a guide toward a blazing summit, Mount Kilimanjaro. Metaphor or not, that's how many describe what they've lived through in their darkest minutes. Near-death experiences are not rare. People who have faced drowning, accidents, cardiac arrest, or massive trauma recount with startling clarity what they saw while, supposedly, unconscious. A brilliant light, a tunnel, the feeling of leaving the body, floating above the scene, feeling peace, meeting loved ones, or even a divine presence. But not all are comforting. Some are hellish. People have felt anguish, isolation, suffering, even torment. As if for a moment, they descended to the other side, and then returned to tell the tale. Christof Koch, from his neuroscientific perspective, does not dismiss these testimonies. While skeptical of supernatural explanations, he acknowledges the psychological scars these experiences leave. Many are transformed. They lose their fear of death, detach from material things, develop a spiritual view of life. What is fascinating is that these memories do not fade. They are not like dreams that we forget. They are etched with a sharpness that defies logic. Some experts argue that these near-death visions aren't mere snapshots of dying, but messages encoded in consciousness. In those liminal moments, time itself dilates, seconds stretch, yet everything feels infinitely meaningful. They report perceiving truths about love, life purpose, even cosmic order. These insights arrive unbidden, beyond language, and after the return they linger, as anchors of meaning. The mind may emerge changed, more compassionate, more humble, more aware of how fragile and sacred existence truly is. Some report a flat EEG, no apparent brain activity, yet Koch raises reasonable doubts. It is not easy to synchronize what happens in the brain with what a patient recalls hours later, often under sedation. Science points toward physiological explanations: oxygen deprivation, hypoxia, reduced blood flow, ischemia, or sudden activation of certain brain regions under extreme stress. Still, the mystery remains. How can a mind conjure visions of absolute peace on the edge of annihilation? Koch recounts an experience not born of physical danger, but of a psychic death. Under the influence of what is called the God molecule, in the presence of a guide, the world shattered. His visual field became dense, dark smoke, swirling, then nothing. A total void. He remained conscious, but without himself. The minutes that followed, according to observers, were of complete silence. Eyes open, body still, mind absent. When he returned, he screamed, he cried, he curled into himself like a child. It took years to process what he experienced, but from that moment, something changed. His obsession with death vanished. As Jorge Luis Borges once wrote in the Zahir, there are visions so intense they lodge in the mind forever. Even if we cannot explain them, they define us. What if death were not the end, but a threshold towards something unnamed? Some researchers propose that what these testimonies reveal is not just survival, but a shifting boundary of what we consider life. The veil between consciousness and nothingness thins. The mind, under extreme conditions, appears to access dimensions usually masked by routine. These thresholds might not signal extinction, but a transformation. In those overlapping seconds, clarity dawns. You see what really matters. Every heartbeat, every breath. Material things recede. What remains is presence. Presence beyond fear. Perhaps that is the legacy of near death. Not what was lost, but what was discovered. Not the finality of death, but the emergence of something more expansive. What do a monk in deep meditation, someone under the influence of ayahuasca, and a person who nearly died have in common? For Christof Koch, the answer may lie in a specific region of the brain that paradoxically reveals the infinite when it falls silent. The hypothesis is bold yet revealing. Mystical, psychedelic, or near-death experiences may share the same neurobiological foundation. They all share a key feature. The self disappears, time halts, and a boundless sense of vastness arises. To Koch, these sensations aren't magical. They're what happens when the brain's so-called posterior hot zone stops speaking. This posterior hot zone includes areas such as the visual, auditory, and somatosensory cortices, as well as the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus. Under normal conditions, These regions are busy processing what we see, feel, remember, or imagine. But when that activity drops off radically, something peculiar can occur. Consciousness doesn't switch off, it transforms. This brings up an even deeper question. What if silence is not the absence of consciousness, but its most refined form? In the modern world, we associate awareness with constant stimulation, alerts, conversations, tasks. But ancient wisdom suggests otherwise. Many spiritual traditions, from Zen Buddhism to Christian mysticism, describe states of illumination achieved not through thought, but through stillness. When the mind stops narrating, categorizing, naming, something else emerges, a form of knowing that does not rely on language or logic. It may be why so many who undergo these altered states describe them as more real than real. It's not that they see more, it's that what they see is unfiltered, unmediated by the ego's constant need to interpret. Perhaps the brain, in its silence, allows perception to happen directly, without distortion. In those moments, consciousness is not a tool. It is the experience itself. Neuroscientist Melanie Bolly studied advanced Buddhist meditators during what they called pure presence states. No thoughts, no perception, no emotions, no ego. Their EEGs showed a dramatic drop in brain activity, especially in the posterior zone. And yet, the subjects were conscious, at peace, fully present. Koch compares this to the famous Sherlock Holmes story where the dog didn't bark. Its silence was meaningful. Likewise, a brain that can activate but chooses not to isn't asleep. It's awake in a different way. Quiet, but not switched off. This challenges the classic model of consciousness as a constant stream of information passed from one place to another, as if the brain were a radio. Instead, Koch proposes that consciousness depends on the brain's internal causal power, not just visible activity. A mind can be awake, even if the screens show silence. From this perspective, visions of unity, void, or eternity aren't hallucinations but valid expressions of a brain in a special state. A state science is only beginning to grasp. Can the brain, in its quietest moment, show us the absolute? Perhaps the answer lies not in what shouts, but in what chooses to whisper. After everything lived, after the mystical fire, the silence of the ego, the flight outside the body, the psychedelic wonder, one question remains. What is consciousness? Is it merely a biological function? Or is it the very foundation of the universe? For Christof Koch, the transformative experience he had with the so-called God molecule didn't just dissolve his ego, it dissolved his fear of death. It wasn't an intellectual lesson, it was a visceral understanding. His obsession with the end of everything disappeared, replaced by a deep, almost inexplicable tranquility. Not because he discovered a final truth, but because he experienced a way of being beyond the self. Some say that in those rare moments of transcendence, images pour forth that feel more truthful than waking awareness. A melody of color, sound, emotion, without subject or object, becomes experience itself. One may not see with eyes, but with presence. Boundaries blur, fear dissolves, value shifts. Even memory changes its role, no longer defining you, but reflecting you. Afterward, something vital remains: gratitude. Compassion deepens. A new sense of wonder anchors life. For Koch, these fragments of insight are not random. They hint at what consciousness might truly be. Not just what the brain does, but what it is. In his quest to understand consciousness, Koch has collided with the limits of the traditional materialist model. The one that says only matter, space, time, and energy exist. But What if all of that could vanish and experience still remain? Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer sensed this long ago, that consciousness could exist without subject or object, without will or thought. In the purest aesthetic contemplation, the observer disappears, and only the observed remains, fused with what is. Aldous Huxley, in The Doors of Perception, suggested that the human mind acts like a reducing valve, narrowing the flood of universal intensity. We perceive not totality, but what is necessary to survive. Yet in certain states, mystical, psychedelic, or extreme, that valve opens, and what flows in is so vast, so absolute, that words can't contain it. From this view, consciousness is not the result of a working brain, but the essence that enables it. And in this model, the universe is not a machine. It is mind, it is presence, an infinite web of possible experience. Koch doesn't claim this is the final truth, but he recognizes that extraordinary states, lived, felt, integrated, offer clues. Clues that we are more than we think. Clues that maybe, like in a lucid dream, reality is consciousness playing at being matter. And if that were true, then awakening isn't escaping the world. It's realizing you are the world. And that concludes our video. If you enjoyed the content as much as we did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our updates. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next video.